Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Where Should US AI Policy Be Headed Next? My name is Hodan Omar and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, which for those who don't know is a think tank focused on the intersection of data, technology and public policy. I'm really glad to be having this discussion today because algorithms and AI seem to be the order of the day, not only in the news and in the courts, but in our schools and many other parts of everyday life. And since we're in the early days of a new Congress, I think it makes it a really good time to ask, where does the policy sphere stand? And so today I'd love to explore three key questions. Where does US AI policy currently stand? Where should US AI policy be headed next? And how can the United States better collaborate with like-minded countries on AI policy? Thankfully, I am joined by a very distinguished panel of experts that cover a range of perspectives. We are joined today by Dr. Lynn Parker, who is the director of the AI Tennessee Initiative at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and is also the former director of the National AI Office. We have Paul Lekes, who is the Senior Vice President for Global Public Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association, the SIIA, and Alex Engler, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and an associate fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. Thank you all for joining me today. And for everyone who's joining us at home, this is really meant to be a program that is very interactive and your questions and comments are very welcome. So if you're watching online, you're invited to submit your questions via Slido. If you're watching on the Center's website, you can see the link at the bottom of your page to Slido where you can submit these questions. And so I'd love to just kick things off and talk about where US AI policy currently stands. So Lynn, I'd love to ask you, there are lots of different types of policy that the government uses to spur innovation, from those policies that support research to those around workforce training, standards, government adoption. And one of the key tasks of the National AI Initiative under your leadership has been to structure and prioritize the activities in each of these areas. So what can you tell us about the work that's happening in these different areas and what lessons have emerged?
Well, certainly it's a large landscape. You talked about research and workforce training and standards and so forth. So there's clearly a lot going on. I think one of the overarching lessons that has emerged from all of these activities is really the power of collaborating and coordinating across the agencies and with the executive branch coordinating and collaborating with the legislative branch or Congress. It sounds maybe like apple pie, but I think that's one of the ways that we across the nation have been able to be successful in making progress in all of these big areas. It's very much about focusing on those actions or topics where we have common interest and we have identified priorities for the different missions. I think by having all of these agencies being coordinated, it really gives us the opportunity to raise awareness of what the agency's challenges and opportunities are, so that as we shape policy, we're looking at it from a holistic perspective as much as possible. And so that's something that I think that we have learned, and certainly that was what Congress recognized as part of the National AI Initiative Act of 2020 when they established the National AI Initiative Office that I was the founding director for. Was really a key goal really is to make sure that we coordinate those activities across the federal government. And one of the reasons why that has been so important is because there is a shortage of expertise across our government. You know, we have a handful of people in a number of different places that understand AI policy, and we've worked together to make a lot of good progress. I think there are a lot of good pieces of legislation and executive orders and actions that lay a good foundation for AI policy. But in order to implement it, we do have to work together. And so that's why finding those common approaches, some early pilots maybe that one agency has done that others can learn from, has been an effective way to move forward as well. It also provides an opportunity to do kind of a red teaming exercise where you have some approach that maybe an agency is pursuing, or maybe draft approaches that have been worked on collectively. And now you have expertise or perspectives from all the different agencies and both Congress and the executive branch to look at what the holes are, look at what we need to consider more deeply. So I think that coordination piece is key to making progress across the board, and that's something that I think has worked well. I think there's certainly more that we can do, but that's, I think, the biggest lesson that I would point out.
Mm-hmm. Alex, one of the things I didn't mention was the governance side. On that side, the White House released the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights last year, which you argued really characterizes, or likely characterizes, the administration's approach to regulation. Can you talk about what that approach is, what it gets right, what it's missing?
Sure, and thanks for having me. It's a great question. The AI Bill of Rights is an important document. It's probably the defining document from the Biden administration that contextualizes the harms and risks of AI, especially those that are really pertinent to governance. So it's focused a lot on proliferation of AI and things we typically regulate, human services like hiring or education or healthcare provisioning, financial services, to a little bit commercial surveillance. It's not totally universal. There's a little less on things like critical infrastructure, a little less on online information ecosystems or consumer products, but it covers a lot of the things that we really see in the news about potential AI risks, and we've seen backed up in scientific literature about how it can be harmful. So in some ways, this was really good. It is a broad contextualization of that concern and says, hey, this is a thing that matters to government, building on some of the work we've seen from previous executive orders. And I think it did motivate some agencies to do more of this work. We have seen more voluntary action, some of it predating the AI Bill of Rights, which again is voluntary. Like the EEOC has been working on AI hiring since substantially before this effort. But some other agencies, you can see a little bit of a pickup of action. The Department of Education looking at AI in personalized learning systems in K-12 education. Maybe you could tie this to other efforts from HHS, Health and Human Services, looking at AI and healthcare provisioning, but a little bit of encouragement. Now, the downside is that if you were an agency not especially motivated to do this work before, you might not still be doing it now. And it's hard to miss the complete absence of law enforcement, both from the scope of the AI Bill of Rights and from the associated agency actions. They just are not present. And so if you were hoping that law enforcement was going to implement some rules on itself and its own use of AI tools, for instance, facial recognition or other surveillance tools, we haven't seen that yet. So that's kind of the good news and the bad news. I would have liked to see more from the Biden administration on the executive orders issued by the Trump administration, which I'm sure Lynn Parker contributed to. If they're not, it's hard to know how much, but I'm sure at least partially to her credit. And there were two. One that said, this was EO 13960, that said federal agencies should classify their uses of AI. And that has been, the response has been a little underwhelming. They were only asked 3 questions about their AI systems by the CIO Council, and the resulting inventory seems suspiciously sparse and not super informative. And I frankly wish the Biden administration had pushed agencies to do a little more work there. That would have been a very tangible step forward for looking at how government's using AI and setting some rules on that. And the other, EO 13859, which is about how agencies regulate. Agencies were asked to create a regulatory plan, like how their current rules affect AI systems, which is a really good idea for how they could see AI changing the regulatory scope in all sorts of ways. And only one agency actually did it. Health and Human Services deserves a lot of credit. They did a really thorough job talking about 12 or 13 different statutes and a dozen or so emerging use cases and some research that was going on in the field, and actually shows you how valuable that endeavor could be because their response was so thorough. And unfortunately, no other agency did it. And while I think the AI Bill of Rights is really great for what it is, I think it really should have been paired with investments on executing on those 2 Trump administration era EOs.
Thank you. Paul, I'd like to ask, what are some of the other important documents and initiatives that you think have come out in recent years?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me here. This is a great discussion. Lynn and Alex are, have done incredible work in this space. there's been a lot of work over the past few years in AI at the government level, and it's been very encouraging. Lynn has been was what spearheaded so much of that during her time in the government, and I think that there are some really promising initiatives that are underway. As people, many people on this webinar may know, NIST issued its first version of the AI risk management framework back in January. And that is a foundational document, I think, for our government and the work between our government and different stakeholders, including private companies, to try to guide the development and the implementation of AI that comports with responsible principles, that builds on a risk management framework, one that looks at where are the key concerns around safety and security and rights and so on. And this is something that, from my perspective, I would say that industry is very supportive of. It is a voluntary framework. It doesn't compel any action, but it does comport with where academics and industry are in terms of looking at how do we get AI out there to maximize the benefits of this set of technologies while also minimizing the risks. So that's a really important piece, I think. And, going forward, we'll be looking at ways in which the government may try to incentivize the adoption of responsible AI principles and try to encourage AI to be used in ways that maximizes the benefit and minimizes those sorts of risks that I mentioned. And so I think that, in coupling or as a complement to the AI blueprint for a Bill of Rights that Alex spoke to, the NIST framework is really an essential document and one that we want to emphasize going forward.
Thank you. I think that kind of gives an idea of where the US currently stands. And so I want to shift a little bit into the meat of this discussion. Where should US AI policy be heading next? And so I'd like to ask each of you, what are the most important issues or areas that you think policymakers should be focusing on in the coming year, from your perspective? And so Lynn, I'd start with you, and maybe I'll also marry in a question that we had from the audience, which was to maybe give some examples of, you mentioned successful cross-agency AI collaborations. If we want to do more of that, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I can give an example that I think was really impactful. So back in, it was 2019, we hosted at the White House OSTP, we hosted an AI in Government Summit. And we had a few agencies give some vignettes of examples of how they have used AI successfully. And so one of the examples that was given at that summit was from HHS, where they talked about how they had run a pilot project that surveyed the regulatory code that's relevant to their own operations, and then came out with flags of regulatory code that was out of date or conflicting with pieces of code that were conflicting with each other and so forth. And when that was presented, other agencies saw it and said, oh my goodness, this would be relevant to us as well if we had a tool that could look to see if our regulations, the code in the regulatory code is out of date or contradictory and so forth. So that led to effectively a call for proposals from, I think GSA led that, to ask for effectively a kind of a commercialized version of this product that all agencies could use. And so from that, just a discussion where it was just bringing agencies together to talk about what they're doing, that then led, after it took a year or so, but it then led to a product that multiple agencies can now use. And so that helps maintain some consistency with their regulatory approaches and make sure that that they're not putting out any kind of new guidance that is contradictory with old guidance. And it also helps them to flag what's out of date. So so that's an example that I think led to some really good collaboration. And it's something that the agencies that had not done that probably would never have done in the near term. But by those ideas being sparked, it really gave them an opportunity to work together and sort of use the expertise at other agencies. So that's just one example of many that I could give. So, Hodan, to your question about what we should be focusing on going forward, I think Alex touched on it too. I think we have a lot of really great policies that are out there that are foundational in terms of principles, say for regulation. The OMB memo that came out at the end of 2020 lays out a regulatory steps. So the implementation of what we have is what has been lagging, and Alex is on this, and I want to kind of foot stomp that as well. I think it's probably true anytime you have a new administration come in, they have their own set of priorities, and the implementation of these executive orders and the OMB memo from the prior administration was not the immediate priority, and so agencies pick up on that and they don't make the progress. But I think as time goes on and as we see that we need to have this consideration of not only the use of AI in the private sector, so that's the regulatory angle, but also the use of the AI by the federal government. Both of those are actions that I think most people agree, yes, we need to do that. And we have the foundational policies in place to help us make progress, but we need to emphasize and prioritize the implementation of those policies. So I think that's one thing. For instance, you can also look at the AI in Government Act, which calls for something similar to that Executive Order 13960, which was about promoting the use of trustworthy AI in the federal government. And both of those are calling on OMB to create guidance for the agencies on how do you responsibly design, develop, use, procure AI. And as far as I know, there's been relatively little progress on that. So that's something that I think we really need to put an emphasis on. I think one additional kind of on the positive side is more policy as it relates to democratizing participation in AI, particularly on the R&D side. So the National AI Initiative Act of 2020 called for the creation of the National AI Research Resource Task Force to figure out how to democratize the computational and data infrastructure that's needed for more people across the country to engage in AI R&D, and including those groups that traditionally have been underrepresented. So now there's a plan in place. That task force delivered that plan in January. And so now the next step is really to authorize this concept, and hopefully Congress will take that action and then build it out. And then we can get more people involved in AI R&D, which I think will help us make advances in an area that hasn't been as well explored. And of course, the whole regulatory challenges of what we need to do to really have a holistic approach to regulation continues to be an open question.
Starting off with what you began with around HHS, if anyone from HHS is watching, I'm glad that they're getting so many shout outs. Alex, I'd ask you the same question. What's the most important area that you think policymakers should be focusing on?
Sure. So I'll start with a quick foot stomp in return for Lynn. I do think I try not to use the word democratize AI because it's a little euphemistic. Maybe it's right, but I do like this effort around expanding research capacity. We are currently headed towards an interesting scenario where kind of the default is a very small number of corporate actors have the capacity to develop some of these very large models. And it would be nice to have a broader range of stakeholders, especially academia, who you can watch being left behind, right? You can just watch the investment of academia in the capacity to build these large models fall behind the corporate side, just as a natural product of where the investment funding is, right? And the scale of the investment funding. So I do think that's an important step, and I would encourage that. I think for the future of U.S. government, governance, there's really three broad areas that we're really lagging behind systemically. probably all of which require legislation. One of which is data privacy, right? Which is, we won't rehash the issue here, but has been going on for some time and is inextricable from this larger technology policy debate. The second is platform governance, which is maybe even less likely to see meaningful change, though it's certainly related. And the third of this, like, what are the priorities of tech policy in terms of protecting people, in terms of regulation and consumer protections, is this like AI and socioeconomic decisions. So it would be really useful if we executed on those two executive orders that we've mentioned, but there is still probably, it's early enough to identify some significant shortcomings with our current regulatory and civil society protections. By that, I mean, if you move from a human process for something like hiring to a algorithmic process, you probably, in most of those cases, you actually lose government protections. It is harder to enforce anti-discrimination law. It is harder to go through a civil liability process to prove that you were discriminated against. It's possible you might have less insight into a system because you may not know an algorithm was run. It's less likely you're able to ask someone to explain what happened. You might not be able to check if the underlying data was correct. In a lot of these cases, the shift to an algorithm is actually kind of bad for the average person going through this process, even if it's maybe better overall for a company, or it's faster or more efficient or something else. And that, I think, will require some sort of broad changes in regulatory agencies. One, if you want to think about what those changes might be, one is considering simple technical things like administrative subpoena access. Can a regulatory agency actually go evaluate data and models if it has a strong suspicion that something is, that one of these systems is breaking the law? And that is not, for a lot of agencies, not the case. And that's a structural limitation in actually enforcing any existing law on a system. It becomes substantially harder to show if something's being discriminatory, for instance, or is not making, is something more close to the FTC enforces, like is making a claim that the algorithm cannot back up. Even if they were able to do that, there are real limits on rulemaking authority. So in the AI Bill of Rights and in the executive order on responsible use of AI, about regulation, there are all these lovely principles, but most agencies absolutely cannot enforce those principles. They can enforce a couple various things on algorithms tied to their pre-existing authority. The EEOC and employment can say that you can't discriminate and you have to tell people and offer some human alternative with people with disabilities. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau can say if you deny people credit with an algorithm, you have to give them an explanation, and you also can't discriminate. But all of these are like little tiny adaptations from pre-existing law. No agency in the US can actually execute on all those principles, right? And so we should also be considering whether we want to really enforce them, whether we really think these principles are valuable. And then if we do, we have to give agencies some more rulemaking capacity, or they're just sort of words we think would be nice. And then to Lynn's point earlier, also staffing. At some point, these agencies are going to need more capacity, more people. And I'll just mention there is one encouraging effort, which is the SMEQA, which is a data science hiring pilot. That's sort of a different hiring process that seems to be working to help bring some talent into the federal government. I've gone on way too long because I think about this too much, but that's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you. Paul, I'll hand over to you. What do you think?
Well, starting with the last point, I completely agree. We need more talent and expertise in the government to be able to deal with all these sorts of things. And to build on Lynn's point, we definitely need more coordination at the government level. It's one thing to have an agreed set of principles, but we have to go more into operational activity. And I think that that requires a more effort on interagency. It may require some action by Congress. But we want to make sure that the government is using these sorts of tools in a way that comports with what we would expect the government to do and what the law would require them to do with regard to civil rights and civil liberties. I think when we're looking at the, what sort of policies can we advocate that would have an impact on the broader ecosystem in the private sector? I want to emphasize Alex's first point that we need a comprehensive federal privacy law in the first place. And while privacy AI has to do with a lot more than just privacy. This is really a baseline for a lot of what we see. And there are proposals and laws in place already at the state level that are privacy laws, but they do touch on an AI and on automated decision making. And I think that we need a baseline, and then we can build on top of that. I do think it's worthwhile for agencies and Congress to look at what sort of guardrails do we actually need in key areas like healthcare, like access to employment, housing, areas that have a direct impact on individuals and how artificial intelligence tools are being used there, and whether we actually need additional laws or regulations to supplement the existing framework that we have in place around discrimination and other sorts of protections for individuals. So I think that is a worthwhile endeavor that Congress should really be involved in the near term. We see other countries and the European Union are already making steps in this direction. The United States just hasn't broached that topic in the way that they really need to.
Thanks. I think you answered one of the questions that we had around data privacy, and I'd love to dive into the EU and the EU's AI Act in a little while. But while we're still thinking about US AI policy and where it should be headed next, it feels like we can't really have this discussion or any discussion about AI policy these days without talking about ChatGPT. And so, ChatGPT and general purpose AI systems more generally, one of the things that is being said, there are new implications and perhaps there needs to be new regulation around these sorts of systems. And so my question is there a risk that policy might disproportionately focus on potential new risks rather than thinking about the kind of established demonstrable risks from the algorithms that are already being employed from different types of AI systems, those ones that are being used perhaps in socioeconomic decisions. And so, Alex, I would pose this to you first.
Sure. So I have a slightly contrary opinion here, which is that this is not a leading issue for me, right? The three things I just mentioned, AI and core socioeconomic decisions, platform governance, data privacy, are orders of magnitude ahead of this, personally. I just think the harms are much well demonstrated. The impact of those decisions are so high that's where a lot of governance should be focused. Of course, there are two examples where these general purpose or generative systems or foundation models or whatever you want to call them kind of play a role. One is in these commercial uses where someone will take ChatGPT or something like it, retrain it or reapply it to something we might traditionally regulate, like cover letter analysis or giving legal advice, right? And those scenarios, I think, are going to be much more common. This is an example of what some people at the EU has started calling the AI value chain. You have multiple organizations building an AI system together. And you probably have to account for that. We probably have to think about how we address what you do when one company builds an AI model and then another company applies it, and how you think about liability, and how you maybe encourage information sharing or encourage sort of grant language between the two to make sure there is accountability for the system at the end of the day, right? Because essentially you're taking a decision and splitting it up across two entities and neither have perfect information into that decision, right? Which is a little tricky for some of this high risk stuff, right? Especially because it's pushing the limits of the technology in some of these circumstances as well. So that's one. And the other example for ChatGPT that I think you're going to see a lot of real interest in is reducing malicious use. This is really hard. Even the best risk management systems I can imagine are circumventable, and you'll still have malicious use. If you have people using this stuff to do automated hate speech or automated harassment, if you want to create deepfakes, and even if you prevent it when people put it online behind a paywall, like behind an API, the open source models are going to get better and people will still find ways to do this. That is a really tricky problem, but I wonder if actually the solution isn't really at the model level. It's not really preventing people from using generative AI. It's actually at the platform level. It's preventing the dissemination of harmful information, preventing the dissemination of non-consensual pornography, of hate speech, of disinformation and misinformation. And that makes me think that one of these is really actually about how you govern the commercial use of AI for high impact socioeconomic decisions. And the other is really actually a platform governance decision. Now, I could be wrong. This is sort of an emerging issue. And I think I should caveat that a lot of us are still figuring out how we feel about how big of a difference these generative models are going to make.
Yeah. Lynn, what's your take on this question?
Well, I think one of the things that tools like ChatGPT do is to put in the front and the foreground, I guess, the conversations about these kinds of systems and what the implications are. I think there's I caution against the reaction to, oh, we have to control this in some way through a policy or regulation, when in fact it might be really coming back to an education point. That if people understand what these tools are and how they could go wrong, or the strengths and weaknesses of them, what are good uses of them, and so forth, then it helps level the conversation so that we're not always sort of reacting to the next thing. And it also, I think, it should help us to step back and realize that this is a fast changing landscape, and there's always going to be the next thing. And if we don't step back and think about how we want to approach, say, a regulatory approach in a consistent and reasoned way that's not reactionary to every new thing, then this is a good illustration of just, again, how quickly the space moves and how we can't just constantly be reacting to the next latest thing. But back to my first point there about this coming back to kind of an education challenge. Of course, now I'm back in academia, and the question for education is real. What should the policies be at the university or at an education level about how students use these kinds of tools? So you have a publication, you're a journal editor, and you want to know what are the right ways that such tools could be used in the creation of a journal article, or what about in research? What's responsible conduct of research as it relates to these tools? And so I think it's difficult for education communities to answer these questions if they don't themselves understand what these tools can and can't do. And so I think that then comes back to a need for kind of the collective technical community to help provide some training and education for everyone at any level, so that people can really understand what these tools are all about, so that they then, like an individual university or an individual school system, can decide what policies they want to put in place. I don't necessarily think that for all these potential, the fact that a student might cheat, well, okay, so that's something for an education organization to address. It doesn't really require a national regulation, but we need to empower those in use case environments like the education system with the training that they need and the understanding of these technologies, so that they can make good decisions on policies that they might want to set at the local level that makes sense. And it's constantly this trade-off between this is the wave of the future, and so you want to make sure that students understand how these can be used in helpful ways, like to create a marketing brochure for your company very quickly, but in a way that's not damaging learning outcomes when students are just using these to bypass writing assignments. So I think it really opens up a lot of important conversations that we all need to have. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to end up with regulation. I don't think it should, but I do think it should end up with an increased awareness of how we all need to better understand these technologies.
Well, some of the, it seems like some of the empowerment of individual institutions isn't coming from a national level, but, cities and states making their own AI policies and own, AI investments. And, given your work in Tennessee, I wonder if you have lessons from kind of local initiatives and what states might be doing to better empower their own, AI innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I keep coming back to this topic because I think it's fundamental to everything, which is, again, how do we help students to learn about these technologies? It's an education and talent development issue. If you look at industries that are not the big tech companies, but they're industries like manufacturing companies that are common across the state of Tennessee, or any kind of organization that's not fundamentally a tech company, you find that they have a high need for people that understand technologies in this space. So, and they need people who can contribute to their advances as it relates to that company. So this is something that is, we talk about often the importance of having innovation that's across the country. It's not just in Silicon Valley or in the Northeast, for instance. And we need to have more of that innovation capacity and understanding across the entirety of the country. And this is frankly lacking. And so I think this is something that at the national level, perhaps, you get into kind of the DC bubble, or when you talk about tech stuff, you're sort of talking within DC amongst people who studied this deeply, or you're in Silicon Valley where people, are deep experts, but you forget that most of the country is not either of these things. And so you forget that that the rest of the country sees all this going on, but themselves perhaps are not participating as much because, again, it comes back to that talent and education. So I think at the national level, we need to have more of an emphasis on providing education opportunities so that people can understand these technologies. They can be involved in the next wave of innovation, and they can contribute to the policy discussions as well, so that it's not just restricted to those inside the DC Beltway or kind of the tech companies. So I think this is something that, when you get outside of those hubs, you realize that most of the country wants to participate. They see the opportunities, but they also see the lack of the education and training opportunities that help make it easy to scale this kind of knowledge across the board. So that's something that I think can happen at the national level that would help everyone at the state and local level as well.
Mm-hmm. Paul, we're getting a lot of questions about the EU in the Slido. So I want to shift a little bit to thinking about other like-minded countries. And so the EU's AI Act is obviously a very important legislative development in Europe. I wanted to ask you, in what ways do you think that the AI Act might influence or has already influenced US AI policy, and your thoughts in general on this?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. If I could just take one moment to respond on the ChatGPT question, and I want to footstop what Lynn said about education. I think education is essential in a couple of different spaces. I think that there is research showing that education, and civic education in particular, is a way to address the growing threat of misinformation online, but also we need more education and skilled people who are working at this. And I think that in the area of general purpose AI, and more specifically generative AI, we're not really at the place where formal regulation makes sense. I think guidance, best practices, materials that assist in education are really essential. But apologies for stepping away from your question on the EU AI Act. As many listeners probably know, this was introduced almost 2 years ago by the European Commission in April of 2021. The AI Act has been evaluated substantially, significantly, by stakeholders, by different European constituencies, by folks in the United States and across the world. I think the most significant thing right now about the AI Act is, it's not yet implemented. It has shifted the conversation globally in terms of what sort of regulations do we need and can we expect around AI. And I think in the United States, looking at the experience that companies have had with the GDPR, which set out a framework for privacy and data protection, and has had a global impact and has influenced the development of state laws in the United States and national laws in other countries. There is an expectation that the AI Act will or could potentially be a de facto global regulation of AI systems. The AI Act adopts a risk-based framework in a way. It is a different type of risk-based framework than we see in the work that NIST has been developing and is reflected in the risk management framework issued in January. And I think, over the course of this year, we're going to see further amendments to the European AI Act. And that is going to have a significant impact on the way in which AI systems are developed and deployed around the world. I think it's notable that there are some really significant issues that remain outstanding as the European Parliament considers the AI Act, including how even to define artificial intelligence. And that's pretty fundamental. And another key issue is how to classify high-risk AI systems. And so we will be, monitoring that very closely and engaged on it. But it is an incredibly significant piece of the puzzle on global AI regulation.
You mentioned defining AI, and Alex, you just had a piece come out recently on what's in a name. What are your thoughts? Are there lessons for the US on defining AI?
Yeah. Okay. So in some ways, actually, there's a lesson for the EU from the US, and that broad lesson is, or maybe we're learning from each other. It's hard to know the order here, but the broad lesson is that defining what you're worried about with the phrase AI that universally covers or even broadly covers risks of algorithms is functionally impossible and not really worth trying to do unless you absolutely have to. Unfortunately, the structure of the EU, because they have to kind of have some definition to to broadly set what they're doing in order to pass this legislation, they kind of have to do something. But the lesson is if you can avoid it, avoid it. And by that, I mean the alternative, which is sectorally specific or even application specific guidance, is dramatically preferable. A good example of the far other side of this coin is if you look at what the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission did with how the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to hiring systems. You can read thousands of words about just them applying this one law to this one type of algorithmic system. Right. And that guidance ended up being really, really good, right? Or really helpful because of that specificity. The farther you get away from those sort of sectorally or application specific and legally specific guidelines, the harder this problem gets. There's just very little that you can say that's true about the AI and a safety component in a plane and the AI that's approving or the interest rate for setting the interest rate for a mortgage, right? They're just really different in every conceivable way. So the EU is a little bit stuck here. There's a big conversation about whether it's just machine learning and algorithms that learn or algorithms more broadly. And I think really the answer is that they should start with a broad definition, say, hey, everything could be in this risk category, and then create a mechanism that lets them get to that specificity later, right? That lets them evaluate. Sometimes it's going to be machine learning in this mortgage application, and we really care about that. But other times a rule-based system that might be straightforward and we don't really think about as a modern machine learning application, but is deciding something very important about educational access or about healthcare provision. Well, that's going to qualify in that case too, and we're going to apply the rules to that. And I think getting away from having that single AI definition be the end all be all of what's in this act and what's not is going to be nearly impossible. Whereas there are mechanisms that they can do to get towards that sectoral specificity. It is a little bit harder to them. We are lucky to have national regulators, right? We have one regulator for the US on a lot of these issues, whereas Europe is working in this harmonization across many member states. That does complicate the picture for them. So it's not like they ended up here for no reason. They ended up here because they have a different structural challenge. But there is a lesson, and it's if you could avoid defining AI for everything at once, it's a good idea.
actually just piggybacking on this idea and also on something you've written in the past, which is, you've said that oversight and accountability in the tech sector is created largely by a journalistic outrage cycle. And I wanted to ask you to what extent you think that's true for AI, and what's a better system if that one's a bad one?
Sure. So I'll try to be quick. I think actually the example I remember, and that there was like a tweet from someone who was suggesting that him and his wife had very different credit limits, even though they went through the same credit process. And that actually triggered like an investigation by a New York regulatory agency. Like that tweet like went viral, and then a New York regulatory agency like investigated. And it almost doesn't matter if that's true or not. The investigation eventually stopped without charges to the company, which I won't even mention. So it didn't go anywhere, but it doesn't even matter if it did. That's just like a ridiculous way to draw our attention to things. The problem is that like and this is indicative of something, an individual, it's very, very hard to tell why something happens to you through an algorithmic process. So if there was gender bias where the man was getting a higher credit limit than the woman, I don't know how you would know that, or know that there wasn't, and it was because some of your underlying data or some of your other credit history or some of your other complex financial history, just in the current state of things. A lot of this kind of happens passively to people. And even as an expert, if it happened to me, I probably wouldn't be able to reason particularly effectively. What this means is we really want accountability. We have to find some way for some of these systems to have a more systemic evaluation. Platforms are a good example. Individuals cannot tell you what is happening on a platform. It is extraordinarily hard to really understand their holistic impact, right? Whereas Europe has passed something called the Digital Services Act, which will let them systemically evaluate the effects of platforms for some things like health misinformation, right? And sometimes there are circumstances where the risks and harms, I think, rise to the level where you do want to be able to do those systemic evaluations. And just a tiny throwback, both Lynn and Paul mentioned the idea of education. I actually think that computer science education, like universal computer science education, is not only a great idea for as an economic investment. I mean, I think it's very clearly great for innovation and capacity. It's also a good civic investment, right? You just need a certain amount of algorithmic literacy to really understand what's happening to you in this world. And that's true today, and it's certainly going to be true over the coming decades. So I actually think, I mean, literally universal CS education in K-12 would be a huge step forward and would be worth every penny.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I to come back to how we should work with the EU and other countries. Lynn, I'd like to ask you, what are some specific areas that you think that we should seek collaboration around AI?
Yeah. So I think this concept of risk is an important concept, and if you think about what the EU AI Act what the U.S. has learned from that, or how it's helped the U.S., or what the lessons are either direction. I think one of the things that the EU AI Act does is that it attempts to put an overarching framework for what we do for particular use cases of AI that we find particularly problematic, and then says, okay, in those cases, these are the kinds of things that are expected. Now, we can certainly quibble about how you define AI, how you consider what's risky, what you need to do when it's risky. But that overarching idea that that's a process that you should follow, I think, is good. And certainly, if you think about that overarching process, that was what the OMB memo back in 2019 that Alex has mentioned a couple of times was intended to do. It was saying this is the overarching sort of process or principles that you think about when you think about regulation of AI in the private sector. Now, what it's laid out a number of things that agencies should have done in order to make progress toward the implementation of that. But certainly one of the things that it did was emphasize that sector-specific, use case-specific approach that we've mentioned here a number of times, and how I couldn't agree more with Alex that kind of approach is so much more valuable. So if we And we have the advantage of that, as Alex has pointed out, in the United States, where we have regulatory agencies that have authorities over certain sectors and use cases. And that makes it much easier in principle for us in the United States to accomplish this than it does in the EU. But with all of that said, I think this overarching framework of saying, okay, let's consider what's risky. And then when it's risky, then what do you do? So the question of what is risky is something that we don't have a common understanding of what that exactly means. The EU AI Act has approached this by saying, oh, here's a a use case that's so risky we forbid it. Here's classes of categories that are high risk. But I think it's not effective in the sense that it doesn't account for new use cases that may come along, or it's overly broad. And so I think having the U.S. and frankly the whole world, but the U.S. and the EU to be able to think about what do we mean when we say risky. And so NIST AI Risk Management Framework is a great step toward helping us to think through a process of evaluating risk. But I think there's so much more that we could do around that fundamental concept that I think, at high level, we all agree on. We need to figure out what's risky and what's not, so that we're not putting an unnecessary burden on use cases that just because it's in the medical domain doesn't necessarily mean it's high risk, for instance. And so we need to be able to put more of a fine tooth sort of comb on those use cases to figure out what really is risky or not, and then what you should do about it. So that's an area that I think is very ripe for increased collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, no, those are phenomenal comments. I completely concur in the sectoral-based approach. I think a good example of this in the United States is how the FDA oversees and regulates medical devices that incorporate AI tools. I think that's an area where there's a clear safety issue, and you have experts in a expert regulatory agency who are determining what level of review is needed. And that's the sort of thing that I think we should be looking at. AI is a tool or a technique that is incorporated in myriad ways. And I think deferring to the experts to assess the level of risk and where we actually need government oversight is a really important guidepost on how to proceed.
I'll also ask you, Paul, we're not diving into data privacy in this conversation necessarily. No. When you think about AI policy broadly, data privacy and other areas are important too. And so are there things that policymakers should be thinking about that's coming down the pike that kind of help them think about where they should go with AI policy?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, obviously, is federal privacy law. That's something we need. But as I mentioned earlier, when we see proposals for federal privacy laws or state laws, they inevitably include some level of regulation around AI and algorithmic decision making. And we're talking here about a subset of AI that incorporates personal information. So I think it's important in that context to think about different types of privacy enhancing technologies and how we can minimize the potential harm, privacy harm to individuals by incorporating technologies that actually would enable certain capabilities and socially beneficial uses without exposing individuals' information and identifying them in ways that they don't expect and don't want.
Yeah. Another area, actually, other than data privacy, that you've written about, Alex, is open source software. You say that it's an important area for AI policy, but doesn't necessarily get discussed in discussions around AI policy. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure, I'd love to frame it. I'd love be interesting if Lynn tells me I'm wrong and that this came up all the time, but it seems to me under discussed. So a lot of the data science and machine learning engineering community, which is like the people who on a day-to-day basis are building AI systems in specific commercial applications, the overwhelming majority of them are using free and open source tools. the best deep learning tools that exist come from open source versions of what Facebook and Google use. They are largely accessible in a public and entirely open source programming language like Python and R or Spark. And the building of this is communal and open and really valuable for deploying this. It's great that all this infrastructure is free. Now, however, it is often harder to support open source development and maintenance over the long term. The US government also often supports things like research into AI. We have tons of money coming through, for instance, these National Science Foundation institutes. And a lot of the times it helps create advances in the field and often new code that can be used by other people. But open source programming, like open source languages and tools, take a lot of maintenance. You have to update them with the language. You have to write good documentation. You have to make sure it works and you fix bugs and you're responding to new demands and need for features. It's an insane amount of work. And like the people who maintain these packages are always frustrated because of how little money there is to support them in what very clearly is important infrastructure. This is especially true for things in the responsible AI area, things like transparency and explainability, things like fairness and bias, things like checks for robustness. It's not always as easy to support those specific things either. So I would kind of like to see even a small percentage of the money going into AI research being directed towards those sorts of open source tools, which I think of as like public infrastructure that are really valuable. You know, we're spending billions of dollars on a new applied directorate for the National Science Foundation, and this is a really specific area that I hope they look at, supporting open source software for responsible AI. And just like the why, every minute you make it easier for a data scientist to make a responsible AI system makes it like much more likely they deploy it, right? If you make it faster and more convenient for them to be responsible, then it's more likely that they will. It raises the floor. I think that's a really important government intervention.
Yeah. Lynn, you know, Alex asked at the start of the question, is he wrong? So is he wrong? You know, are these discussions happening?
So there are at kind of a lower level, there are some discussions, and certainly there have been examples of funding agencies supporting open source tools. You know, I'm a roboticist from long ago, and so ROS, Robot Operating System, is an example open source tool that has really revolutionized research in robotics, and that was funded by federal funding agencies to help support it, not initially, but then to help support it. But, you know, you can think about in the context of things like safety and cybersecurity. And if you have a lot of our AI is built on these open source tools, are there foundations of these tools that maybe are not, you know, they're not written in such a way that it prevents bad things from happening by injecting cybersecurity bugs and so forth through that open source that's the foundation of so much of our AI. So there are a lot of interesting angles here on not only making these open source tools available, but also making them robust so that they are not going to be brittle and break and have sources of attacks that can again, cause unintended consequences. So I agree that this is a key part. And it also ties together to this theme that we've been discussing about making participation in AI open to all. Yeah. You know, the idea that you can have low code and no code approaches to AI, and a lot of those are also open source kinds of tools. So anyway, I agree very much that this is an important part of the overall ecosystem of AI.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and we've discussed so much, and I've heard some, you know, themes coming out. You know, things like keep regulation sectoral. That's what works best. Education, and you know, support democratization of participation. Though the word democratization is debatable, and so I wonder if there's a final word from each of you on, you know, where U.S. AI policy should be headed next. Paul, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. You know, from the perspective of industry, because I work a lot with companies, you know, there's a lot of companies out there that are doing their best to advance AI in a responsible manner. And I think that they want to see that kind of support from the government, and also ensure that we are promoting innovation at the same time that we're trying to put the appropriate guardrails around certain types of effects and harms and uses of artificial intelligence. And a lot of the discourse is really about the negative effects on AI. But I think that we also need to think about the ways in which AI can actually help us and help us to achieve socially beneficial outcomes. I think there is appetite for additional government involvement, but we need to make sure that we're also enabling innovation to continue. And from a United States perspective, exerting global leadership around AI innovation and development.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, I do think the balance of public policy has somewhat decidedly been on the encouraging AI use, right? You have this new NAIR plan to build infrastructure. You have 19 NSF institutes. You have a new NSF directorate. You have the reemergence of industrial policy to make sure we have enough semiconductors to run computing on. You have the Trade and Technology Council, and then the NIAC, which is a council about commercial uses of AI. There is a lot of research infrastructure, policymaking infrastructure in the supporting AI category. And I'm not necessarily opposed to any of that, but I will say, if you look at the broad space of things, it's like that whole enormous body of billions of funding and support and infrastructure, and then relatively incremental increases in protections, right? You have sort of some agencies taking the AI Bill of Rights and adapting what they used to do to some new algorithmic harms, but like pretty slowly and pretty incrementally. So I do think it's fair. Like, yes, we talk about AI harms a lot, but partially that's in response to how much has been done on one side to support AI development and how relatively little has been done on, hold on, a whole ton of companies are going to adopt AI and there are very meaningful risks that remain like largely unaddressed. And so I'm sympathetic to that. It seems like we talk about the harms a lot, but in some ways that's reflecting what's been done. Right. And I think it's reasonable to call for some more strengthening of agency capacity, of data access, of regulatory authority to address those. And then we can talk about something else.
Thanks, Alex. And Lynn?
So I'm going to sort of fall a little bit more on the Paul side on this in terms of we don't need to have the pendulum go from one direction to the other too much. I do think that balance is important. And we can, I think, address the responsible use of AI without doing it in a way that's reactionary and clamps down so tightly and makes it so burdensome on companies to be able to use AI for anything that we don't just squash all of that altogether. So I think thinking about this kind of from a holistic perspective and how we can implement some of these policies is while also keeping the innovation in play. I think that's what we need. And I think where we are right now, there are a lot of good ideas that are out there, including supposedly legally binding things like executive orders. And I think what we need now in the policy space is demonstrations and actions on how to do these things. Guidance that says we know what we're looking for. This is how we do it in these particular use cases, and really have a focus on implementing what we've got in many of these areas, recognizing that yes, there are holes, but being able to show how we can use innovative AI in responsible ways, and what does that implementation process look like? I think that's where the real gap is, and I would argue that that's where we should focus our attention going forward.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for your really insightful comments and a really interesting and timely topic. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who watched and sent in questions. Just a note that this event recording will be found on the website and on YouTube. And also thank you to Lauren and Alex and the ITIF communications team for helping make this event happen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.